Her family sold her as useless until a lonely mountain man built her a cabin and called her wife Deadwood, Dakota Territory. Summer, 1876. The town lay sprawled beneath a sun that cut through the sky like a sharpened knife, baking the wooden planks of the boardwalk until they groaned under the weight of every bootstep. Dust rose in lazy spirals, clinging to the air and the backs of those who wandered through the main square. The scent of dry earth mixed with the tang of sweat and smoke from distant chimneys settling in the lungs like a bitter memory. A crowd had gathered, faces twisted with curiosity, greed, and quiet cruelty. Their murmurs swirled, coiling around the young woman at the center like a predator's breath. She stood on a rough-hewn platform, her hands bound with rope that bit into her skin. Her dress was nothing but tattered rags, her hair wild and matted from neglect, strands falling over hollow cheeks and eyes that should have been empty but were not. They were fierce, defiant embers in a world that had long since forgotten her worth. Whispers carried across the square. Useless girl. Father's shame. No one'll want her. She stiffened at each word, her spine straight, though every muscle trembled like dry leaves in a restless wind. Her body, fragile as cracked porcelain, seemed ready to give way, yet her gaze burned stubbornly, a small candle flickering against the darkness. The auctioneer raised his gavel, the wood smacking against the stand with a sharp crack that cut through the murmurs. "Do I hear 50? $50 for the girl?" His voice, high and authoritative, echoed across the square, bouncing off the sun-bleached walls and through the heat-thick air. Men shifted, pockets clinking, hands scratching stubbled chins. Women peered through lace veils, eyes widened, voices low with disapproval or intrigue. The girl said nothing. Words were a luxury long denied to her. From the hills beyond the town a shadow moved, coalescing among the pines and scrub. The man's hat was wide-brimmed, casting a darkness across a face lined with solitude and old regrets. His eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the square with a predator's precision. Not hunger for profit, but hunger for justice. His life had been carved from silence, cold nights, and broken promises, and yet something in the girl's fire spoke to him. It pierced the weariness in his chest, a spark catching on dry timber. She shifted slightly, and their eyes met, hers wary, cautious, yet alive with a stubborn light, his steady, unwavering. No words passed between them, yet a promise formed in that moment, more binding than any rope. The injustice of the crowd, the casual cruelty of her father, the suffocating weight of helplessness, all of it crystallized into a single thought in his mind. She does not belong here. The crowd's murmur rose, swelling like a storm, and hands began bidding. Each call for money, each harsh appraisal of her value, was a knife turned in her chest. She swallowed, her throat dry, and looked past them, past the faces twisted by greed and disinterest, toward the distant hills where the shadow lingered. A faint glimmer of hope stirred. The auctioneer's gavel fell again, louder this time, punctuating a bid that seemed almost criminal in its casualness. The girl's knuckles whitened as she gripped the rough rope, a tiny act of defiance in a world that demanded submission. The crowd did not notice the slight flare of her spirit, but the man on the hill did. He had walked through dust and silence, through years of solitude, and now he recognized the rare truth. Resilience does not bow easily. He began descending the slope, boots stirring clouds of dust that drifted like ghosts across the prairie. Each step was deliberate, measured, the scrape of worn leather against rock echoing faintly in the thin air. His eyes never left the girl, scanning, protecting, calculating. The crowd was a dull roar behind him. The girl's fear and fragile dignity pulled at him like gravity. A sudden gust lifted dust into the sun, and for a moment she disappeared behind a veil of brown haze. The wind whispered secrets through the cracked boards of the platform, through the hollows of the town. When the dust settled, the man's silhouette emerged solid and unyielding, a wall against the cruelty of the world. He stopped at the edge of the square, the heat rising in waves from the sun-baked earth, and whispered almost to himself, a single word that carried across the wind to where she waited, trembling yet defiant. She's not alone anymore. The crowd, still murmur-laden and greedy, did not see the promise, the steel beneath the quiet shadow. But the girl did. In her chest, where hopelessness had long nested, A small spark ignited, a fragile, trembling flame that for the first time in a long while whispered that, just maybe, the world could change, and somewhere deep in the hills. The man's resolve hardened like aged leather, his past trailing behind him like smoke. He would not fail. She would not be sold. And as the sun beat down on the dusty square, casting long, cruel shadows, the story of pain, of courage, and of quiet, unstoppable hope, was only beginning. The town's dust and noise faded behind them as they climbed over rocky cliffs, the girl's boots scuffing against stone and dry soil. The wind whipped through the pines, carrying a scent of sap and cold earth, a whisper of freedom tinged with menace. Her breaths came short and uneven, scraping through her chest like dry leaves skittering across the forest floor. Every snap of twig underfoot made her flinch. Every shadow seemed alive with imagined pursuers. She glanced at him, her eyes sharp with suspicion. Every line of her body was taut, her spine curved like a bowstring ready to snap. His face was calm, expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, and he said nothing. His silence was not empty. It was a language of its own, carved from years of solitude, patience, and observation. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of labor, moved with quiet assurance, steady as the mountain itself. The girl sensed it instinctively. Here, in this man's quietude, was a strength she had never known, a shield she could almost believe in. The path narrowed between thick trunks, the sun filtering through needles to create scattered patterns on the ground. They came to a clearing where the earth was soft and level, encircled by tall pines that whispered warnings to the wind. The man knelt, examining the terrain with an almost ritualistic care. Then, without a word, he began to work. Logs, rough-hewn and sturdy, were arranged in careful stacks. His axe bit into timber with rhythmic precision, the sound echoing across the hills, a heartbeat pulsing through the wilderness. Each strike was deliberate, resonant, a measure of the life he intended to build here. The girl watched, uncertain, fascinated, unable to look away as the structure rose slowly from the forest floor. Walls grew taller, roof beams aligned, and the cabin took shape, not just as shelter but as a statement. She had a place here, a right to breathe, to exist, to simply be. She moved closer, tentative, tracing a finger along a log, feeling its rough grain against her palm. Her past, a lifetime of neglect, of being sold, of being told she was useless, pressed against her mind. And yet, in the rising timber and the steady rhythm of his labor, a fragile sense of possibility bloomed. She was no longer a commodity. She was not a tool or a burden. Here, she was acknowledged. The silence between them stretched, filled with the forest's subtle symphony, wind brushing needles, distant crows calling, the snap of a branch under a wandering animal's foot. Their tension was quiet but palpable, a taut wire strung between observation and curiosity, mistrust and unspoken understanding. He watched her, patient and still, as though he had waited a lifetime for someone to deserve his attention. She studied him in return, noticing the way his shoulders moved, the precision of his hands, the calm decisiveness in his eyes. By afternoon, the cabin stood tall and resolute. The smell of sawdust mingled with pine resin, filling the clearing with a scent that spoke of permanence. He swept the floor, placing logs for the hearth, and finally, as the sky began to soften with the first hints of evening, he struck a match and coaxed fire to life. Flames licked the walls, casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts of a life she might never have had. She felt drawn to the warmth, the quiet glow, the sense of safety that seemed almost foreign in her chest. And then, as the fire crackled, he spoke a single word, low and deliberate, heavy with intent: wife. The word hit her like a shockwave, sharp and impossible, curling around her ribcage and settling there. Her eyes widened, a storm of disbelief, confusion, and something tender stirring deep inside. She wanted to speak, to deny, to question, but no sound came. Instead, her gaze met his, steady, unyielding, full of a promise that felt both daring and protective. Outside, the forest was alive with nocturnal life. Owls hooted from the treetops, wolves howled distantly, and the wind traced invisible paths through the pines. Inside, the fire painted the cabin in hues of amber and gold, wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth and shadow. In that glow, the girl felt something she had not felt in years, trust. Tentative yet persistent, like the first spark of flame caught in kindling. The man sat opposite her, quiet, hands resting on his knees, the flicker of firelight casting angular shadows across his weathered face. She studied him, noticing the faint tremor in his jaw that spoke of restraint, the small crease at the corner of his eye where fatigue and sorrow lingered. He was a mystery, a force of nature hewn from silence. And in that moment, she understood. He would protect her, whether she wished it or not. Night deepened, and the forest seemed to exhale around them, the darkness pressing close, yet softened by the cabin's walls. The girl sank to the floor near the hearth, letting the warmth seep into her bones, listening to the rhythm of his breath, steady and unshakable. Somewhere in the pines, life continued, the whisper of wind through needles, the distant rustle of unseen creatures, the quiet heartbeat of the mountain itself. And as she closed her eyes, the word lingered, resonating like a promise against the ache of her past. Wife. It was more than a name, more than a claim. It was a beginning. The cabin, rough-hewn yet enduring, stood in the clearing like a monument to possibility, to safety, to a life not dictated by cruelty or circumstance. Outside, shadows deepened. Inside, a fragile flame of trust began to grow, slow and steady against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of stillness that presses against the chest, heavier than any words could carry. Frost clung to the pine needles, sparkling like tiny shards of glass in the pale light, and the world seemed suspended between night and day, as if waiting to exhale. The girl stirred under the rough blanket he had laid across her shoulders, eyes fluttering open to a sky washed in muted gold and silver. Memories flooded her like an unwelcome tide. She saw her father's callous gaze, the auctioneer's cruel grin, the jeers of strangers who counted her worth in dollars. Hunger had gnawed at her belly for nights she could not remember, humiliation carved deep into her bones. Her hands flexed, remembering rope bites, the sting of neglect, the sharp laughter of people who had no stake in her suffering. Her chest tightened. Each breath rasped like dry leaves dragging across stone. Through the doorway, she watched him. The man, as if sensing her gaze, did not look back. His axe rose and fell with a steady rhythm, slicing through the crisp morning air like a heartbeat in the mountains. The sound echoed softly against the distant cliffs, steady and precise, a quiet order in a world that had known only chaos. She noted the lines etched into his face, the shadow beneath his eyes, the way he moved. Careful, deliberate, lonely. Each strike of wood against wood, each measured breath, seemed to speak of decades spent alone, of sorrow and endurance, of battles fought quietly and survived. She wanted to speak, to tell him of the memories that clawed at her from within. But words faltered. Silence had long ago carved deep furrows in her tongue, and trauma had made speech both fragile and dangerous. She watched as he stacked the chopped wood, leaned against the axe to catch his breath, then moved on to fetch water from the nearby stream. Nothing was said between them, yet the language of care was clear. A blanket left by the hearth, a hot meal simmering over the fire, water in a bowl, drawn with steady hands and placed just where she might find it. Daylight stretched, and she began to understand. Survival was not merely enduring the cruelty of others. Survival was learning to trust, even when it ached, even when the past whispered its lies at every corner. Slowly she moved, tentative, touching the logs of the cabin as if memorizing the shelter's promise. Here the wind and frost could bite as much as they pleased. Yet the walls were solid, steady, protective, a rebellion against a world that had always sought to crush her. Her fragile peace was shattered when movement caught her eye near the tree line. A man emerged, tall and broad, his silhouette unmistakable, the kind that bore the stench of small-town greed and ruthless intent. A bounty hunter dispatched to reclaim what had been sold. The girl's stomach knotted, panic clawing through her chest like claws on stone. Her pulse thundered, and frost seemed to stiffen in the air around her. The man beside her, her guardian, her rescuer, the solitary shadow of the mountain, did not flinch. His eyes, steel blue and piercing, narrowed. The axe in his hands became a weapon, though his stance was calm, coiled like a snake ready to strike. Every muscle was alert, every sense sharpened. The forest seemed to lean closer, listening to the tension threading through the trees, the quiet rustle of pine needles, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She watched him move. Silent yet deadly, the embodiment of protective fury she had never imagined. He positioned himself between her and the intruder, a wall of muscle, bone, and unspoken defiance. She realized in a heartbeat that this cabin, these walls, this fire, this man, was more than mere wood and nails. It was sanctuary, a bastion against cruelty, a fortress built not just from logs, but from resolve, from love, from a promise she could almost believe. The bounty hunter paused, calculating, but the man's gaze did not waver. Words were unnecessary. The fire in his eyes and the rigid line of his jaw spoke louder than any gunshot could. The intruder hesitated, then retreated, boots crunching over frost-hardened earth, leaving only the echo of menace behind. Silence reclaimed the clearing, thick and heavy, but no longer suffocating. By nightfall, frost had given way to a softer evening chill. The girl moved toward the fire, hands outstretched to the warmth that seeped through the rough fibers of her coat. She felt the heat crawl along her arms, filling a hollow space inside that had long been carved by fear and pain. For the first time in months, perhaps years, a tentative hope settled in her chest. Small and delicate, but insistent. She glanced at him, seated across the cabin. Still alert, but relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed. His gaze met hers for a fleeting moment, the slightest curl of a reassuring smirk touching the corner of his mouth. No words were exchanged. They did not need to be. The cabin hummed with life, the crackle of fire, the whisper of pine through the open window, the faint rustle of a night animal passing outside. And in that fragile glow, she understood. She had a chance to live again, to trust again, to hope. The past had clawed at her, tried to pull her under. But the mountain, the cabin, and the man who had become her shield were stronger. Her fingers brushed the rough log at the edge of the hearth, feeling warmth not just from the fire, but from a life slowly reclaiming its light. The wind outside whispered through the pines, a lullaby that carried away fragments of fear, leaving her with a fragile, trembling certainty she might survive, and one day she might even be free. Days folded into one another like the soft curl of smoke from the cabin's hearth. Isolation, once suffocating, began to weave intimacy between them. The girl's voice, fragile and timid, crept back into existence in small, hesitant bursts, words like fledgling birds testing the wind for the first time. She would murmur a question, a name, a stray comment, and he would respond with nothing more than a quiet nod or a slight smile. His silence was not emptiness. It was a balm, a patient rhythm that slowly stitched her fractured spirit together. Evenings became their ritual. They sat outside the cabin, shoulders brushing unknowingly, eyes tracing the flickering embers as they drifted lazily into the inky night. The wind threaded through the pines, carrying a mournful hum that wrapped the forest in song. Stars glimmered above, indifferent and cold, yet somehow bearing witness to their tentative connection. The girl watched him in those moments, the set of his shoulders, the faint scar tracing his jaw, the way his hands rested lightly on his knees, and felt something dangerous stir, trust, and something warmer than she had ever known. Romance, subtle and deliberate, grew in the space between them. Hands brushed accidentally, or perhaps by design, sending a shiver up her spine. Their glances lingered, a silent communication heavier than speech. Laughter, soft and unexpected, broke through the stillness of their solitude like sunlight piercing storm clouds. And yet, despite these small intimacies, shadows lingered. Every sudden snap of a branch, every howl in the distance pulled her back to the past. Every faint twitch in his eyes, every flicker of muscle beneath his weathered skin, spoke of battles unseen and memories best left unspoken. Their bond was forbidden, delicate as frost on the pine needles. Society, if it knew of them, would brand their union unnatural, born of desperation rather than choice. But in the pines, insulated from judgment, survival and closeness became their language. Each act, tending the fire, mending a torn coat, gathering water, was charged with unspoken desire, with the thrill of trust slowly solidifying into affection. The first snowstorm arrived suddenly, sweeping down from the high cliffs white and merciless. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying flakes that bit through clothing and stung bare skin. The outside world vanished beneath a blinding curtain of white, and they were forced into proximity. In the cabin, walls insulated only partially, they huddled near the fire, the warmth between them amplified by the chill beyond. Silence settled over the small space, thick and charged, every glance and movement loaded with meaning. A sudden cry from outside startled them. Together they found a wounded animal, a small deer, caught in the snow, trembling and bleeding. Nursing it became a shared task, a metaphor laid bare. Survival demanded cooperation, care, courage, and trust. Her fingers pressed against its matted fur, his hands steadying her, guiding without command. In this fragile moment, fear melted into intimacy. Their eyes met over the creature's small, quivering body, and unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. They were no longer two souls navigating solitude. They were entwined in responsibility, protection, and something more tender, more dangerous. Night deepened, the storm relentless outside. They fed the animal, warmed it, and tended to its wounds. Their hands brushed repeatedly, each contact lingering. Each spark felt like lightning in her veins. They spoke little, for words would have spoiled the fragile balance of trust. Instead, the firelight painted their faces in gold and shadow, revealing flickers of hope, traces of longing, and the quiet admission that their lives, once separate and barren, were beginning to converge. As the animal finally settled, breathing shallow but steady, the girl sank to the floor near the fire. She traced the warm logs with her fingertips, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside her, the crackle of flames, the storm's howl outside. The walls of the cabin, rough and uneven, felt protective, a sanctuary she could almost believe in. And for the first time she allowed herself a fragile thought. This could be more than safety. This could be home. She whispered the words, almost to herself, letting them float into the warm smoke. Maybe this is home. The man did not respond. He did not need to. His steady presence, the quiet rise and fall of his chest, the faint warmth radiating from his side, was affirmation enough. Outside, snow swirled in restless sheets, the forest hidden beneath white silence. Inside, embers flickered, reflecting in her wide, trembling eyes. And for the first time in a long while, she believed in tomorrow. The night pressed on, long and slow, but the storm outside could not reach the fragile trust growing within the cabin. Each glance, each touch, each moment of shared care for the small, wounded animal cemented the unspoken connection between them. She realized quietly that love, like survival, required patience, tenderness, and the courage to trust again. And in that quiet, storm-bound night, in the pines and the flickering firelight, something new had begun, a bond not forged in the rush of society or circumstance, but in the slow, deliberate intimacy of two damaged souls finding each other amidst winter, snow, and silence. Word traveled faster than the wind. Whispers of the girl's escape and the mountain man who had taken her spread back to the town like wildfire through dry grass. Greed and shame twisted her family's hearts. Men were dispatched, their intentions clear and merciless, reclaim what they had sold, and teach both girl and rescuer the cost of defiance. The man, awake before dawn, moved methodically through the cabin and its surroundings. The snow lay thick over the forest floor, crisp underfoot, each crunch a drumbeat heralding what was to come. He checked his weapons, inspected traps laid along the hidden paths, and adjusted logs and beams with precision. The cabin, once a simple refuge, had become a fortress, walls reinforced, windows obscured, vantage points secured. Every detail bore the mark of a man who had lived by the mountain for decades, who knew its secrets, its dangers, and its power. The girl watched him from the doorway, her breath fogging in the cold air, heart hammering. She had learned to trust, to see his silent strength as her shield. But the imminence of violence stirred something unfamiliar. Fear mingled with exhilaration, adrenaline brushing against the tender trust they had built. Snowflakes drifted lazily at first, then in a growing flurry, frosting the world in white and muffling the distant approach of their enemies. It began without warning. The first shots rang out, echoing off cliffs and pine, startling birds into the gray sky. Snow erupted as boots pounded through the drifts, men advancing with harsh yells and raised rifles. The man moved like a shadow among trees and logs, silent but lethal. Wood splintered as he struck with a heavy beam, fists collided, and a body was thrown into the snow with a dull thud. He fought with precision, power contained within deliberate strikes. Every move spoke of skill honed in years of solitude, battles fought against nature and men alike. The girl's chest tightened as she watched, awe and terror mingling. He was calm, unflinching, a force of nature, yet his eyes flickered toward her, always aware of her presence. She saw the raw courage etched into the lines of his face, the quiet fury that matched the storm raging around them. Love, she realized, was forged here in the snow, in the struggle, as much as it had been nurtured in the cabin's quiet warmth. A sudden betrayal splintered the battle. One of the supposed allies, someone who had come under pretense of aid, turned against them, trying to ambush the man from behind. The girl's heart lurched. She stood frozen for a moment, torn between panic and the instinct to act. Survival demanded courage, and courage demanded choice. With a deep, shuddering breath, she surged forward, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it with desperate force, forcing the traitor to stumble back into the snow. Her muscles ached, her palms stung with splinters, but adrenaline sharpened her senses. The battle continued, chaotic and cinematic. Snow sprayed like white bullets as men collided in the clearing. Shouts, gunfire, and the metallic clang of weapons rang in the frozen air. She followed his lead, ducking, striking, moving as though the forest itself guided her steps. Fear still pricked at her spine, but it was tempered with the newfound understanding that she was not helpless, that her life, her choices, her body and her will were hers to wield. Hours passed in a blur of motion and noise. By late afternoon, the attackers began to falter, their energy spent, their will broken against the man's relentless strategy and the terrain's merciless edge. One by one they retreated, slipping through the snow-laden forest, leaving only the echo of their failure in the wind. The cabin stood battered but unbroken, its walls streaked with splintered wood and frost, a monument to resistance, to love, and to rebellion. The girl sank against a log, chest heaving, her breath fogging in the cold air. She traced the marks of battle, the snow-streaked earth, the broken branches, the man's scraped knuckles, and realized that survival was no longer just endurance. It was participation, courage, and the understanding that she could fight alongside him. Shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, the man approached. Bruised and bloodied, the fire of exertion and fury still burning in his eyes. He extended a hand, rough and warm despite the chill, and she took it, squeezing with quiet acknowledgement. Their silence spoke volumes. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, distant coyotes howled, and snowflakes drifted lazily, indifferent to the human struggle below. By sunset, the clearing was quiet once more. Shadows stretched long across the snow, brushing against the cabin like soft fingers. The battle had ended, leaving them bloodied, bruised, yet transformed. The forest seemed to exhale, the violence absorbed into its vastness. While inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly, a comforting heartbeat in the aftermath. She looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the man who had saved her, but the protector, the teacher, the one who had shown her that strength and love could coexist. In his eyes, she glimpsed a reflection of herself, capable, resilient, and no longer defined by the cruelty of others. The cabin, rough-hewn and enduring, stood as a testament to what they had survived together, a sanctuary that would weather storms, human or otherwise. And as darkness fell over the snow-blanketed mountain, the girl understood a profound truth. Love was not only tenderness, warmth or quiet fires, it was steel, blood, and the courage to fight for one another, no matter the cost. Winter loosened its grip slowly, the snow melting into rivulets that ran down the mountainside, carrying with them the chill of hardship and the promise of renewal. Pines, once heavy with frost, now shimmered with buds, needles glinting in soft sunlight. The streams, previously trapped beneath ice, rushed with a lively murmur, tracing paths over stone and root like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. In this changing landscape, the girl moved with purpose, her body no longer frail, her spine straight, shoulders steady. She had become a force of quiet strength, tempered by suffering, but refined by survival. Together, they repaired the cabin, their movements synchronizing in a rhythm born of trust and necessity. Logs were lifted, walls reinforced, the hearth mended and fortified. But more than timber and stone, they fortified hearts. Every hammer strike, every careful placement of a beam, carried with it unspoken messages. I protect you. I trust you. I choose you. Their bond, once tentative and fragile as frost on a pine needle, now ran deep and unbroken, the current of it flowing silently but powerfully through their shared existence. Words were scarce, chosen with care when they came. A single phrase, soft and deliberate, could carry the weight of hours or days of emotion. She brushed the calloused lines of his scarred hands, tracing the map of battles survived and pain endured. He reached forward at unexpected moments, lifting a loose strand of her hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear with a tenderness that belied the strength in his frame. Shadows of the past lingered in the corners of their minds, yet they no longer dominated the present. The mountain, the cabin, and each other had become their sanctuary, a place where scars were honored and not condemned. Nature itself seemed to bless this fragile equilibrium. Hawks circled overhead, their cry slicing through the still air like a sentinel's call. The wind threaded through the pines, carrying whispers of continuity and renewal. Firelight danced against the wooden walls, illuminating their faces in flickering gold and amber, painting them in light that held both warmth and revelation. Even the animals of the forest moved with a quiet respect around the cabin, as though recognizing the bond that had been forged here. The girl paused at the door, letting the sunlight kiss her face, and glanced at him. His expression was steady, eyes tracing her silhouette with an intimacy forged from hardship and survival. He did not need words to communicate what had grown between them. The air between them was heavy with understanding, with acknowledgement that what had started in despair had blossomed into something far more profound. As dusk approached, the sky painted itself in muted shades of amber and violet, clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. They moved outside the cabin together, boots crunching softly on the thawing earth, side by side yet silent. The mountain held its breath around them. Finally, breaking the stillness, he spoke, voice low but resolute, carrying across the clearing. "You are mine." Not in chains, but in choice. The girl's eyes glistened, tears catching the light like dew on newly budding pine needles. She allowed herself a smile, small at first, then broader as the weight of the past lifted imperceptibly from her shoulders. Words were unnecessary. The mountains, the cabin, the whispering pines and the rushing streams were witness enough. Their lives, once fractured and bruised by cruelty and neglect, had found equilibrium. They were no longer two broken souls seeking solace. They were whole, together, and unshakable. They sat, shoulders brushing lightly, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind distant peaks. Shadows stretched across the clearing, mingling with the golden glow of the fire still smoldering in the cabin hearth. The wind stirred the pines, a gentle symphony that carried their quiet triumph into the wilderness. Above, a hawk circled, indifferent and eternal, a silent guardian of the mountain that had forged them. The camera, or the reader's eye, lingered on the scene. The cabin nestled in its clearing, smoke curling from the chimney, framed by trees that had endured winter's assault. The snow-tinged earth glowed with the soft light of renewal. Two figures, once lost and battered, now sat together, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in quiet, absolute intimacy, the culmination of struggle, resilience, and love. Their story did not end with fanfare or dramatic farewell. It ended with presence, the warmth of a shared fire, the rustle of pines in the wind, the steady beat of two hearts aligned. The mountain, the forest, and the cabin bore witness to their triumph, a sanctuary of light carved from pain, a testament to survival, trust, and redemption. And as the last light faded over the peaks, the girl and the man remained side by side, whole at last, together in their cabin of light.